All right, guys. So here we are back with our second session on our worldview course, right? Now, I want to go ahead and jump right into this because this is probably going to be the most difficult, the most abstract, the most philosophical of any of our talks thus far. Because what we're going to do in this particular course is look at our evaluation and method when it comes to how we look at, how we critique, how we go about analyzing these particular worldviews. Now, different philosophers, different thinkers offer different ways to analyze and critique worldviews, and just any school of thought, that is to say. Um, I'm going to be coming at this from my own angle. When I want to say my own angle, I don't mean obviously that I invented it. I'm not intelligent enough to invent an entire school of thought in regards to some sort of philosophical system, especially in epistemology. Um, Now, epistemology is going to be one of the areas that we're involved in today, simply because epistemology just is the study of how we know, right? Or how do we know what we know, or how can we know? Um, and even that can be argued over in regards to some of the nuance there. But I just want to be forthright and honest and disclose that I'm coming at this from a particular angle. Now, that's not to say that most theistic thinkers would disagree with me in the sense of this overall evaluation of these worldviews as we go through them. We're going to agree for the most part. There's just going to be some particular difference in maybe our specific nuance, our specific methodology, even though they're going to be roughly similar. Meaning to say this, they're all going to rely pretty heavily on logic and certain philosophical principles. Um, Now, the way I'm going to go about this again, is pretty standard, pretty fair, pretty common across the board in regard to moderate realists, if you want to say it that way. That is to say, certain types of theistic um, thinkers and or philosophers and whatnot. Um, but again, these are going to be held in common across the board for most thinkers. Um, Most are not going to try to disagree with certain fundamental principles. They're going to argue if those principles are being applied correctly, or if those are being applied honestly or consistently. But they're not, for the most part, going to disagree with certain principles, again, of logic and rules of logic, so on and so forth. Now, with those preliminary remarks out of the way, let's go ahead and look at this as we start to look at these systems of thought. Let me move this. All right. So obviously, as the slide says here, before any evaluation or meaningful discussion even, right, before you can even evaluate, even just discuss these types of topics, we're making a rather huge, a rather fundamental assumption. And that assumption is just that what? Is that if you look at the slide, we're just assuming that truth can be known, right? That we can actually progress in knowledge, meaning that there's something out there called truth that we can align with, or we can be wrong in accord with, right? That is to say that we're not in line with. Now, this is a pretty big assumption because in one sense, guys, this is a worldview itself, right? That or it's at least included in multiple and a couple of different worldviews, that we can know the truth, right? Now, what we want to do is we want to show that this is not an unjustified assumption, or that this is not an unjustified presupposition of some sort, but that it's most aligns with reality, right? Meaning that this is just the way things are, and this is what we have to work with. And there's reason for thinking as much. It's not an arbitrary starting point. Maybe we should say it that way. Or if we want to be even more generous, maybe we can even say something like this: it's the least arbitrary starting point. Now, I would take the former statement and the more strong statement that it's a non-arbitrary starting point. Don't want to confuse you there. Let's just keep going. Now, just to follow the slide, it would obviously be a waste of time to evaluate and think through various claims of competing worldviews if we can't even know the truth. I mean, that's just obviously true. That it would be a waste of time to even talk about this stuff, to try to discuss any of this if none of us can know the truth at all. It'd be like listening to two guys sit around arguing over which flavor of cereal is the best to each individual, right? That would just be completely subjective. So let's go. We're going to go from these for lack of better terms, principles here. We're going to go from this principle. This first principle is that truth and reality can be known. Let me say it again. Let me say it a slightly different way than even the slide says it. I'm going to affirm, yes, that truth and reality can be known, but also truth about reality can be known. Also, from this classical philosophical angle that I'm coming from, I would say it even this way too, that to know reality is to know the truth, right? And to know the truth is to know something about reality. We may even frame it that way. But for all intents and purposes, we can just say it this way, that truth and reality can be known, right? That we can know things, we can know true things, we can know reality, right? That we can actually know some stuff, right? Now, let's be clear, the claim is not that we can know everything about reality, or that we can know all truth exhaustively. That would be a pretty radical claim. It'd be a pretty almost, well, not almost, it would be a rather insane claim to say that we, based on the nature of what we are, contingent, finite beings, can know all of reality on or left to our own devices, right? So that's not what we're saying. We're just saying that truth can be known and that reality can be known, right? At least some, right? So look down at the second thing on the slide here. To deny as much, that is to say, to deny the truth can be known or reality can be known, is going to be either self-defeating, right? Meaning it's going to contradict itself. It's going to violate some logical principle, namely the law of non-contradiction. And or at best, it's completely inconsistent to say that we can't know the truth or that we can't know reality. So let's recap that just so far. We can know truth. We're going to go with these axioms, these principles, I should say, that truth, at least some truths can be known, right? And that reality, or at least much or some aspects of reality can be known. And to deny that, right? To deny that truth can be known, or to deny that some aspects about reality can be known, is going to either be self-defeating, self-referentially incoherent, self-stultifying. It's going to be self-defeating. And at best, it's going to be completely inconsistent to try to argue that reality can't be known, or that the truth about reality or truth itself can't be known. And we're going to unbox that. In other words, as the slide says, we may elaborate on those 2 points, right? So as it also says, buckle up. We're about to begin some deep thinking here. Now, my hope is that you're already familiar with some of these philosophical principles. If you are, then this is going to be just nothing but a nice, enjoyable review of those principles that you already know or that you're already familiar with. If you don't, listen to this as many times as you need to become familiar with these concepts, because these are going to be utilized over and over and over and over and over in philosophy and in courses and in your life, so to speak. Now, let's look at the first. Truth can be known. Now, that statement hinges on what we would call the law of non-contradiction, right? The law of non-contradiction just simply says that A can't be not A at the same time, in the same way, in the same place, and in the same sense. Again, it's just a basic contradiction. And it's contradiction in the truest sense of the word, right? So, for instance, this is not a contradiction. What I'm about to say is not a contradiction. I went into the coffee shop and I saw William. Oh, so did you go into the coffee shop and you see William? Oh, I went into the coffee shop and I saw Russell. Well, wait a minute. You just contradicted yourself. First time you said you went in there and saw William. Second time you said you saw Russell. That's not a contradiction. Why? Because a contradiction would be to say, I went into the coffee shop and I saw William. Did you go in the coffee shop and see William? I went into the coffee shop and I did not see William. That's a contradiction, right? Because the first statement, I went in the coffee shop and I saw William. Did you go in the coffee shop and see William? Oh, well, you know what? I went in the coffee shop, I saw Russell. The reason that's not a contradiction is because there's a plausible, or I should say it this way, a logically possible way in which both of those two statements could be true. It could be true that you went into this coffee shop and saw William because there's a guy named William in there. And it could be true that you went into the coffee shop and saw a guy named Russell because there's a guy in there named Russell. Or it could be true, in my case, that my name is William Russell, right? My first and middle name is William Russell. And it could be true that you saw the same person and they're both making reference to the same person, even though they're using different names, because both of those are my names, right? But it is a contradiction to say, I went into the coffee shop and I saw William. I went into the coffee shop and I didn't see William, right? That's a contradiction. And it violates the law or the principle of contradiction, right? Laid forth, or not laid forth, but elaborated upon by Aristotle, right, in classical philosophy. Now, one of the typical examples of a violation of the law of non-contradiction would be to say something like, I cannot speak a word of English, right? Right? Or to say, because obviously I've just contradicted myself. I've just stated in English, right? In fact, in multiple words in English, that I can't speak a single word of the very language I'm speaking right now to assert that I can't do it, right? That's contradictory. That is self-defeating. That is self-stultifying. That is self-referentially incoherent, right? Now, you think that's so radically obvious that why do we need a course in this? Why do we need to even go over a concept like that in a course, especially on worldview or whatever? Well, because you'd be surprised how many of the greatest, most influential, and intellectually astute thinkers in the history of the world have violated the law of non-contradiction. It happens. I should say it this way. It's easy to see when the law of non-contradiction is violated or broken when we say things like, I can't speak a word of English, right? But it's harder to see that the law of non-contradiction is also broken, is also violated by saying something like this. I've come to find out that truth is completely determined by the culture in which you live. You grow up in one culture, that's true for you. You grow up in a different culture, that's true for them, right? Or true for you in that culture. So truth is not transcultural. Truth is completely determined by your upbringing or the culture, your society in which you live. Now, right, that sounds more sophisticated, right? That sounds more intelligent, right? It sounds like somebody's saying something astute. But here's the thing. That's just as contradictory as saying I can't speak a word of English. Well, how? Well, think of it this way. What I just said, right, that truth is determined completely by your culture, is that, if that's true, right, if that's true, then that's true for all cultures. And it's not determined by some person's culture, right? If that's true for all cultures and all people and all places, then it can't be true that truth is just determined by their culture, right? Or can't be determined by culture, right? Because there's a truth that's not determined by cultures. There's a truth that's not determined by people groups. That's true for all of them, whether they believe it or not, whether they agree with it or not, right? On the other hand, it's false both ways. So it's false that way, but it's also false this way in the sense that if it's true that truth is completely determined by your culture, well, then even that statement, truth is determined by your culture, is only true for that culture in which it was stated, right? Meaning it's not true for any of the other cultures. But if it's not true for any other cultures, then what metaphysical or ontological weight does it really carry, right? What is it really, what kind of claim is it really saying if it's not even true anywhere else, right? So there's one of the more convoluted yet sophisticated sounding ways in which the law of non-contradiction can be violated, right? Can be radically broken. And what we want to take from that is that if something violates the law of non-contradiction, then it can't possibly be true, because if it's true, then it's false, right? On multiple levels, right? As we just cashed out. It's not just false one way, it's false all kinds of ways, right? Now, one of the more easy examples of a violation of the law of non-contradiction would be something like this. You can't know the truth. Truth is completely unknowable. Again, if you've heard all of this before, this is just a refresher for you. But again, so if someone were to say, the truth is unknowable, right? Well, then you just ask the question, well, how do you know that, right? Because if the truth is unknowable, well, then you can't know that because you're affirming that that is true. But if that is true and you know it, then it can't possibly be said that the truth is unknowable because there's a truth that you know. On the other hand, if the truth is unknowable, well, then you don't even know if that's true because the truth can't be known. And if the truth can't be known, then you don't even know if what you're saying is true, which means it's basically useless. It's not even in the realm of interesting things to say, right? So again, the impact for us is, what we want to take from that is, it must just be false, right? It violates the law of non-contradiction. It can't possibly be the case. It can't possibly be true, right? So those are some examples of violating the law of non-contradiction. There's multiple videos on you can find something like this. I've even got one that if I can put it in the link somewhere, I'll try to remember to do that. It links to another where I elaborate in much more detail about this whole law of non-contradiction. But what about this other thing about reality? Okay, so truth can be known, at least in some sense. It's literally undeniable to deny the knowability of truth, because when you deny the truth, you're making a truth claim, right? But it's another thing about this whole reality business. Like, what about this whole thing with reality? Well, first, when we say something like, you can't know anything about reality. Well, obviously that would be a statement about reality. And if you're quick on your feet right here, or if this is, again, just a review for you, well, then you immediately notice that that is a statement that a truth statement about reality, saying that reality can't be known, which is just completely self-defeating, right? So there's that, right? But I'm not gonna say that everyone is trying to make that sort of statement about reality. Let's say it this way. Let's say that the skeptic says, how do you know that you're not dreaming, right? Because obviously if you're dreaming, or you're in the Matrix type movie, well, if you can't know such things, well, then you really can't know much about reality, right? Other than the reality of your dream or whatever. But the problem, again, with that sort of assessment, or that sort of statement, that sort of assertion, is that the guy who asks you, how do you know you're not dreaming? Well, he literally, in the very question, he has to, what? Assume that he's not dreaming in talking to you to try to convince you, or to try to make you question whether or not you're dreaming, right? He thinks he's actually talking to someone. But if you have to assume exactly what you're arguing against, so think about that. Let me say it again. If you have to assume exactly what you're trying to argue against, then you're already on very shaky ground, right? And at best, you're inconsistent. You may even be offering up a self-defeating position. But again, at the very best, you're radically violating any sort of principle of consistency there. Right. Again, so for instance, imagine you argue that you can't know anything about reality. How do you know you're not dreaming? And let's say the guy listening to you buys your argument. Think about that. Has it hit you yet? Let's say that you're arguing with somebody about how can you really even know anything about reality? How do you know that you're not dreaming? And the guy that you're saying that to buys your argument. Whose argument was he buying? Who was it that was trying to convince him that he can't know anything about reality outside of himself? In order for him to even buy the argument, right, he had to listen to someone outside of himself, not of his own dream, that was trying to convince him that he couldn't know if he was dreaming. Right? You see how just completely inconsistent that is? And if you want to pause and continue to think over that, you can. You can even come up with your own examples of how these certain sort of principles are just very hard to get around without, again, either being self-defeating or without violating in some seriously strong fashion the principle of consistency, right? Now, it seems that therefore we can go ahead and start with a couple basic assumptions. Again, that we can know something about truth, that we can know some truths, and that we can start with the metaphysics, meaning that we can start with, hey, here's reality. I'm experiencing reality. I'm looking at reality. I have access to reality in some sense. And again, if someone would say, well, how do you know that? You could say, well, because this serves as a stronger premise. The fact that I'm looking at it right now, experiencing it right now, touching it right now, seeing it right now, this serves as a stronger premise than any sort of weird philosophical abstract argument that you could possibly give me. In fact, any weird sort of abstract philosophical argument that you could give me would have to come from you. But if it comes from you, well, then I'm experiencing reality, right? Because you're a part of reality external to me, right? In other words, you could say to the guy saying, how do you know you're not dreaming? You could look at him and say, wake up, you're talking in your sleep again, right? Because if his argument's true, then he can't even know that he's talking to anybody, right? So you see the last statement here on this slide. I warned you, right, to buckle up because we're starting to do some deep thinking here, right? But we've said all of that to basically just try to establish that we're starting from a couple principles that most of us are already holding to, but that we also have very good reason to hold to. That truth can be known, that violation of the law of non-contradiction, one of Aristotle's fundamental principles of logic, the other two being law of excluded middle, excuse me. See how even all this starts to fry my brain after a certain point. The law of excluded middle and the law of identity, right? You can look into that more in some of our reading if you want to. But we're starting from a couple key principles. That we can know something about reality and that we can know some truths, right? And any attempt to deny that, right, to deny that you can know truth is going to be self-defeating or inconsistent. And any sort of attempt to deny that we have access or know reality is going to be inconsistent and or at worst self-defeating. So let's continue to move on through here. All right, get that situated. We got it. All right, so having said that, when we look at worldviews, right, you're thinking about the first course again, or the first lesson in the course, right, all of those specific worldviews that we look at. When we look at each of those, we're going to at least just try to give some sort of cursory example of what each actually believes. But then when we start to critique or analyze or evaluate those worldviews, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at those worldviews in light of logic and some of these philosophical principles, because we can't get around those, right? We can't get around those. Those are something we're just going to have to deal with no matter who we are. So to read the slide here, all of the worldviews and philosophical claims will be evaluated, discussed, and thought upon in relation to the foundations of logic, right? And knowledge of reality. Those are those first two principles, right? That we can know some truths and that we can know something about reality, right? So again, all of the worldviews and philosophical claims will be evaluated, discussed, and thought upon in relation to the foundations of logic, right, and knowledge of reality. It will be important to note that this will be our test. So when we're talking about our evaluation and our method, this is going to be something like our methodology. This is going to be something like our test. This logical and philosophical methodology that we're going to employ. Hey, is this worldview, does it violate the law of non-contradiction somewhere, or principles of logic somewhere in a very strong way? Does it deny the knowledge of reality in some way, right? Those are going to be at least a two-pronged part of our methodology as we evaluate and think through these worldviews. However, we're going to look at another test, and this is going to be something like we talked about earlier. Remember when I told you in the first lesson to put this back in your brain about this consistency, that some of these worldviews are going to be more or less consistent with themselves, whether inside themselves, which would be something like the logical, the reasonable, the rational aspect, or if they're consistent with themselves in their outworking, right? Meaning, can you live it? Right? Can you live what that worldview is telling you consistently? And that'll make more sense as we get into those worldviews, right? So, to read the last statement of the slide, however, an existential or life experience test will be employed as well. Again, meaning that, can I live out the implications of this worldview consistently? Can I consistently live out the logical implications of the worldview that I'm thinking about right now? What would be the logical implications of this worldview if it's true? And am I even able to live them out in a consistent fashion, right? Now, some of you that are familiar with philosophy, you would see immediately that that doesn't necessarily prove that it's false, right? Some of the implications of a particular worldview may be unsavory, right? They may not necessarily be something that we would want to stomach, right? That doesn't mean it's true or false yet at that point, but it is an important part of the test when we evaluate those worldviews. Because remember, it's not the only test, but it's another additional aspect that we have to take into account, right? Because we could say, if nothing else, then if a worldview can't even be lived out consistently, if the logical implications of a worldview are such that you can't even live them out, then that is a red flag. At the very least, it's a red flag against that particular worldview, and it's a red flag in the sense that maybe that worldview should be investigated a little further, right? Which we plan to do with our internal test of the logical and philosophical principles that we'll look at there, right? So just so you know, we're going to look at that existential, right, that life aspect, right, about living out these worldviews, if they can be done, if they can even be lived out. Now, let's go back to our first couple questions that we had in the very first lesson, right? The first couple of questions that we ended the first lesson with were simply, how does one go about evaluating a worldview, right? The second one was, how does one go about choosing, right, or even abandoning a worldview, right? And the last was, why ought one evaluate and or choose a worldview, right? So let's take those in turn. The first, how does one go about evaluating a worldview? Well, everything we've discussed so far, that's how. We do it by logic and sound philosophical principles, right? We evaluate a worldview. We evaluate a philosophical system of thought by logic, right, and by sound philosophical principles. In our case, whether they're self-defeating, whether they're internally consistent, and whether they're existentially viable, right? Can it even be lived out? Those are at least some of the important ways that we would evaluate a particular worldview. How does one go about choosing? How does one go about choosing or abandoning a particular worldview? Again, piggybacking off that first answer, if we see that a worldview if we're trying to choose a worldview and we see that that particular worldview is logically inconsistent, is completely irrational, is incoherent, doesn't seem to correspond to reality, then that would probably be a good indication that we should either not choose that worldview, or if we have already adopted that worldview, to abandon it, right? It's just a train wreck, right? It's a mess. It's an intellectual mess, maybe even an existential mess, a life mess, an experiential mess. It can't even be lived. It's such a mess, right? Now, this last question, why ought one evaluate and or choose a worldview? Well, I don't have this written on the slide, right? It says the first answer is because ideas have consequences. But before we get to that, why ought one evaluate and or choose a worldview? Well, one, because truth is important for truth's sake, right? Truth is an end in and of itself. We don't just have truth. We don't just pursue the truth for pragmatic reasons, right? We don't just pursue the truth because it gets me something in the end, though if something is true, then it will work in the end, so to speak. But we pursue things, or we pursue the truth, because the truth is invaluable in and of itself. Now, if you were to ask me, well, why is that? You're expecting me to say what? You're expecting me to give you the true answer, right? That helps us to see that truth is valuable in and of itself because we want to know the truth, right? Even if it doesn't necessarily help us, quote unquote, in some way, we still find ourselves wanting to know the truth. Well, how do you know? Well, do you want me to give you the true answer or the not true answer, right? Again, we see ourselves doing this. It's almost, as some philosophers would say, self-evident in some sense, that we want to know the truth for the truth's sake. Now, going to the second thing that I actually do have written here on the slide, why ought one evaluate and or choose a worldview? Well, one, because truth matters for truth's sake, but here's the thing, because ideas have consequences, right? So, okay, look, be existential goofball, right? Or eclectic goofball, however I labeled him in the first lesson there. Be eclectic goofball and watch what happens. Just see what happens. Your life's going to be a train wreck. Society's going to be a train wreck. Culture's going to be a train wreck. You see what has happened when, or when people adopt a specific worldview and they live that out consistently. We've seen time and time again what happened to cultures and societies when bad ideas have taken root and people have lived them out consistently. I don't want to tip our hand too quickly here, but when you come to the belief that human beings are distinguished from human persons, right? If you've come to the belief that there's a difference between a human person and a human being, sure, so-and-so's a human being, but they're not a human person, and therefore we can kill that human being. Well, look what happens. When someone literally comes to believe that, they believe the logical implication that there's a difference between a human being and a human person, well, then we end up with all sorts of human rights violations, right? We see slavery start to abound. We see people killed in the name of some sort of philosophical principle that they weren't really a human person, even though they were a human being, right? We just see all sorts of implications, all sorts of crazy things begin to happen. On the converse, we see people treated with dignity and respect and value when the ideological roots take hold that no matter who you are, no matter your race, no matter your culture, no matter your socioeconomic status, no matter your place in the family or society, that you have worth in the sight of God and man, something like that, that when people really take that to, let that idea take root in their minds and they live that out consistently, we see the ramifications for that idea once it's given out or written out to its logical conclusion. So again, ideas have consequences. That's why we ought to choose and evaluate and critically analyze and think through these big topics of worldview. They're very important. Again, because they're valuable for truth's sake, and getting ahead of myself there, we don't need that yet. Because we value truth for truth's sake, and because ideas have consequences, and we see where those go in the long run. Now, hopefully, this has been a little shorter of a message, or a little shorter session here until next class, when we start to analyze and look through some of those specific worldviews. So, hopefully, you got something out of that. Again, listen to this again. Go back and listen to the first part again if you're trying to, again, continue to wrap your head around some of the stuff about those first principles that we're talking about, the first principles of logic, and or some of those metaphysical principles that we're talking about knowledge of reality, beginning with metaphysics as opposed to beginning with epistemology as our starting point. Look forward to seeing you next semester, and until then, vaya con Dios, amigo.